Greetings, audience. My name is Sumi Chang, and I'm an instructor at Toronto Metropolitan University, a researcher, and a not-for-profit executive. I'm very pleased to be partnering with the Ontario Not-for-Profit Network to create this web series entitled Leading Through Austerity, Diverse Voices. This series features interviews with diverse women leaders in Ontario's not-for-profit sector, serving equity-seeking population groups, exploring the leadership challenges and opportunities arising from austerity within the sector. Before we proceed any further, I'd like to acknowledge that I live and work in downtown Toronto on the traditional territory of the Mississaugas of the Credit, the Haudenosaunee, the Anishinaabe, and the Huron-Wendat, lands covered by Treaty 13 and the Williams Treaties. As a settler whose family arrived here through migration, I honor the Indigenous peoples who have cared for this land since time immemorial and recognize the ongoing impacts of colonialism. I commit to relationships and actions rooted in respect, reciprocity, and responsibility. With that, I'd like to introduce my guest, Emma Asiedu-Akrofi, the Toronto-based CEO of FORA Network for Change. She is a Black Canadian woman of Ghanaian descent and brings a unique blend of lived experience and operational leadership to her mission of expanding access to education and employment for young women and gender diverse leaders across Canada. She's a dedicated advocate for women and girls, committed to addressing gender-based inequalities, and her work is deeply rooted in an intersectional, anti-oppressive, and inclusive framework. She has over 10 years of experience working in the charitable sector. Welcome, Emma.
Thank
Let
you,
me begin
Sumi.
let me begin by asking you to tell us a little bit about how you got into your position and organization. And in brief, what does your organization do and who does it serve?
Yes, thank you, Sumi, for inviting me to be part of this conversation. I've been in the nonprofit sector now well over, when you read my bio, I was like, it's well over 10 years, but I've been leading organizations for over 10 years. And the way I got into it is really, I wanted to do something very value aligned. I knew that the work that I was doing or wanted to do had to be very purposeful and more so than just chasing the almighty dollar. And so the nonprofit sector was a very much a good match for me. And so through that, I've been able to just work my way up, first leading an organization called the Jean Augustine Center for Young Women's Empowerment, that I was the executive director of for over 7 years. And then most recently in my current role, I'm the CEO for a Network for Change. I'm saying time's flying. I've almost been there for 3 years now, or been here for 3 years.
Uh,
And at FORA, what we do, we are a national charity, but we work nationally and globally to support young women and gender marginalized youth by putting them in leadership spaces and helping them advance their careers. And so we do that in a number of ways, but to boil it down into a nutshell, we support them in accessing leadership opportunities and governance by placing them on nonprofit boards. We also support young people in advancing their own social impact initiatives by providing microfunding and coaching and mentorship. And we are building our grassroots organizing advocacy stream because we know that young people are very passionate. And then we also work at the systems level by providing research and reports and really just advocating for young people and youth in general in the sector.
Great. Thank you so much for that summary. This web series seeks to explore several key issues in the not-for-profit sector, and one of the most significant is austerity. There are several definitions that exist, and I'd like to offer up the OECD one, which says austerity measures refer to government actions designed to reduce budget deficits through spending cuts, tax increases, or a combination of both. And these can be at all levels of government. These measures have significant consequences for the not-for-profit sector for obvious reasons. Within the current context of uncertainty and affordability, in your own words, does austerity exist in your sector and why?
Yes, austerity does exist. I think it's more pronounced over this last year as there's been a change in government or a change in our prime minister. Um, Things are shifting, but I would say austerity has always been there. As I've shared with many people, even with you prior to this conversation, that I feel that the nonprofit sector has always been the least thought of, but we do the most significant impact. I steal the quote that, we're tasked with solving the world's problems, but we're not invested in to solve these problems, right? So it's always been that in terms of piecing out the breadcrumbs, we get the smallest piece. But within this last year, and I remember very vividly because we were at the Commission on the Status of Women in New York City when it was announced that, there would be a change in government, a change in our prime minister, and that Minister Marcy Ian would no longer have that position, and what that would mean for the feminist sector in general. And it got us into a tailspin in terms of how would this impact us? What would the investment look like? And we were already challenged, right? So what would it even be further to not have a voice representing us in those spaces? So it has existed. And it's become even more pronounced. We're very fortunate, though, to have Minister Valdez reinstated, who has been a significant champion for the voice of the sector. And I have seen that even within this austerity space that we are in, the government has been moving towards making investments in the sector, nonprofit in general, but also within the feminist sector, which I could really speak to. And that has come recently with an announcement of 77 million that has been invested, and some extensions on some significant projects that we've been undertaking for the last 2 years, that we were worried about, like, where would the money come from if they were to cut funding for this. A lot of great work is happening, but if we can't do it long term, is it really systemic impact? Are we really changing the system if it's very 1 year or 2 year piecemeal projects? So, all that to say, yes, austerity has always existed. We felt it more in this last year. I'm hopeful the pendulum is swinging because they're seeing the value that we bring in the nonprofit sector and specifically within the feminist sector as well.
Um, I think it's great news that you are seeing that the traction hasn't stopped at the federal level. And I think especially with the appointment of the new minister, it's great news for the women's sector. Certainly where I was at, which is a women's shelter, we had worked closely with Marcy, and she was our MP at the time in Toronto Centre. So it's good that there is another a woman whose social location also understands the challenges that a lot of our clients experience. Um, you've outlined some of the challenges, and I wondered if there were any additional challenges you found or that has really been significant for you when it comes to the impact of austerity in your agency.
Yes, definitely. It's hard to plan. We as organizations take on making these strategic plans that are 3, 5, 10 years down the line. But when we are trying to guarantee funding for even up to 1 year, it's really hard to think blue sky thinking and plan for these times when we're really just trying to keep the lights on. And I can speak specifically for FORA. That's what we just not just last year, we finalized our strategic plan from 2025 to 2029. And we had this tension between being like innovative and blue sky thinking and like what could we really do to support our community of young people versus should we be practical? Should we just, keep the ship sailing, nothing too big, just to ensure that we're able to sustain FORA? And so there was a significant tension there. Fortunately, we were able to come to a compromise where it was still very, something new, something different in how we were envisioning our programming, but still realistic enough to know that if we weren't to get to fund the funding from government or some of our other donors, we could still manage. But managing is not enough, right? No one just wants to manage. We want to thrive. We want to be able to ensure that we are doing our best for our communities. So, yeah, there's been a lot of challenges there.
Great. Thank you so much for sharing that. On a related note, could you speak to the competitive nature of the not-for-profit sector and how it has impacted partnerships and allyship?
Yes, competitive. No one really wants to use that C word because we are all supportive of each other. But in actuality, what it is competitive, right? Like when we put in these applications, there's only a few that will get it. So I think even backtracking on that a bit, outside of even being competitive, because we are in such a state of just like survival, we can't even think partnership because we are just focused on our organization and how we really sustain ourselves. So it doesn't allow us to be creative and think how can we collaborate with these other organizations whose mandates are similar. And that then boils down into how we submit applications. Like, can instead of thinking, oh, let's collaborate on this application, let's submit something that's even stronger and more strategic. We don't even have the time to put thought into that. So we are submitting, and then through that, it's like, how do we differentiate ourselves from the number of applicants that are very well deserving going in for these opportunities as well. So yes, there is a competitive nature. It's not by choice. It's just by survival alone, I would say, for 99% of us that we are doing that. And I would love, like, one of my visions is, especially for organizations like FORA, which is we're small and mighty, these grassroots organizations, that we have the capacity to really think about these things and really work together and like take our time to see how we can, even if it's not monetarily, are there other opportunities for us to collaborate to really push the work that we're doing forward and strengthen our organizations?
You know, um, it's so interesting that some of your comments about the competition nature and just this notion of surviving, like surviving this space, and how there's just no oxygen sometimes to think beyond survival. I wondered, not only the notions of partnership, because you kind of said like with a bit of regret, gee, I wish I had more time and just more space to think about strategic partnerships. Um, but like both as a leader as well as on behalf of your organization, how you have found engaging in partnership and allyship, like personally and organizationally, what that's been like in this really rather competitive environment, right? Like when you were talking, I was like, I hear you. I've been there. I totally get it. It's hard thinking strategically, like, geez, I wish I could partner with them, but oh no, they might go for the same application, so I better not.
Yeah. Like personally, I know so many phenomenal, I will say women of color who are leading phenomenal organizations who I genuinely have care and respect for. And I want us all to win, right? So that's the goal that I have, or that's the hope that I have, that we can all win. The reality is that we all can't, get the pot of gold at the end of the rainbow, unfortunately, right? And as an organization, it's the same thing as I was saying before, is that really it's like the challenge is like we can't even think outside of the box. Like I go to these events and I connect with friends and colleagues, and we're like, okay, let's keep in touch, let's have the meeting, let's start to chat. And then the next thing you know, it's a year later and we haven't even, touched base once because there's no capacity to do that. And I'm not trying to make it sound like we're victimized in that sense, but this is the true reality of the situation. Where coming in with the best intentions. We enjoy the people. We see value in their organizations, but there's few and far between that we are able to do together. Until things really, like, for example, when we heard about the news at Commission on Status of Women, a coalition of feminist organizations came together, and I saw the beauty and the magic in us being really able to work together to push for funding. And I would love to see more of that happen as we move forward.
Thank you for that. So, another critical concept is resilience. It's a term that's used a lot in the non-for-profit sector and can be defined in many ways. I'd like to offer a definition that was put forward by a colleague of mine, John Shields, who's a professor emeritus at TMU. And he has said resilience has been defined as the ability of entities to withstand, adapt, and recover from periods of difficulty, sudden shocks, and crises. What are your thoughts on organizational resilience and how has it translated for your organization?
We've always had to be resilient. There's not a time in how many years in the nonprofit sector and over 10 years leading that we haven't had to respond, adapt, be it during the pandemic, prior to the pandemic, with this new shift in government priorities. We're constantly adapting, and what that looks like is even this. For me, I can speak for our organization, like our staffing compositions. We'll have these big teams and then we'll realize, there's no funding coming down and then have to shrink. And what that looks like is then other people taking on those roles or wrapping up projects that have a lot of potential, but we can't continue them. And so always shifting the vision and the strategy of the organization to meet the reality of the situation. Again, it goes back into not being able to plan. And I think it's exhausting. Again, not to play victim, but it's exhausting. Sometimes it becomes very overwhelming. And you do want to throw in the towel, but then you see the greater value of what our organizations do. When I connect with our participants and our alumni, and they talk about how FORA and other organizations have been such instrumental part of like the trajectory of their lives, we know that these things are needed. Our organization is needed. And so we continue to adapt and we continue to be resilient, even in the exhaustion and the overwhelm. And I look forward to a time where we're invested in and the merit of the nonprofit sector is seen because the work we're doing, if no one was doing it, we'd be in a worse state than we are now. And that's a scary place to be.
Yeah, thank you. Thank you for that. Um, so on a more personal note, um, as a diverse woman leader, as you know, there's so few diverse women leaders in the majority of the not-for-profit sector. And it can be inferenced that it can be probably as low as 10% and under or under. And of all the non-for-profit, when you consider all of the non-for-profit executive leadership positions that are out there, right? There's technically, I believe there's over 86,000 charities registered. Um, and so, given that, what do you think needs to happen to see greater diversity and inclusion in the not-for-profit leadership space? And how do you think austerity has impacted that?
Yeah, there needs to be intentional investment and it has to be systemic changes, right? Because when we're looking at leadership and who is quote unquote ready for leadership and who has quote unquote access to leadership, even before we get to that point, we have to boil it back to saying who has had the opportunity to even be exposed to what leadership looks like, who has been adjacent in to these people, who has been invited into these rooms to really for others to get to know them and for also them to understand what leadership looks like. And that is one of the first barriers that exists, right? So we can't even really start to talk about hiring and who's applying. And when we don't even talk about like who has been exposed, who has been the opportunity to be introduced to it. So there's a lot of work to be done. It has to be very intentional about that. Like we always talk about mentorship and sponsorship, but we need that sponsorship. We need those names brought into the room and to advocate for I would say my tone is always young people because that's who I work with, but diverse women, women of color, to for their names to be brought into the room and for them to have those opportunities, give them stretch goals, like let them show what they're capable of, right? And then once we start to get into the actual recruitment process where we just had this conversation at Fora, what spaces are these opportunities being shared in? Is it shared in spaces where there's underserved communities? Is something that we need to question, right? Is it going out to Black focus, Indigenous focus, to us LGBTQ plus? Like, are these spaces being introduced these opportunities? Because we know a lot of these, yes, they're posted, but a lot of it is word of mouth, who you know, who is sharing your name. And then from there, it's really like having us really look at like the hiring, the representation in the organization. I've seen many large nonprofit organizations and my mouth drops where I see the leadership space and it's all white faces. And I'm just like, how do you represent, especially if it's Toronto or the GTA, how do you represent the Toronto if you don't even have the lived experience sitting at your leadership table? And these are the real conversations that need to be brought to the rooms. And unfortunately, I don't think a lot of people are still having them, even though it should be top of mind for many.
Yeah, thank you for that. I suspect, given your organization's mission, the focus around development and supporting youth towards success and growth and leadership, you must see a lot of some of these structural challenges that exist, right? Like, you've talked about very large not-for-profits and sometimes the limited diversity, if we want to say, in these organizations, which is just undeniable. I mean, these are not pejorative. This is just like fact-based.
Very much.
Um, do you think austerity has had an impact in that? We know that there's some structural, issues around racism and probably oppression that exists in the sector, which is contributing. I hope I'm not, I hope I'm not putting words into your mouth, but I'm hearing this through what you've just said. But do you think austerity has had an impact on this, on what you've described?
I think it's bigger than austerity, right? It comes down to the values and the priorities of the organization. Even with austerity, there are means and strategies and structures that can be put in place to address some of these barriers that are preventing diverse leadership. Let's get creative. We get creative with a lot of things. So there's ways to do this even within the current economic environment that we're in.
Okay, great. Thank you. All right. And given given the state of where the not-for-profit sector is and some of the challenges you've just identified, despite that, what advice would you give to emerging diverse leaders who want to work in the not-for-profit sector?
Find your community. I strive to be people first. That's in terms of my connections, my friendships, my network, as well as within my organization. We are people before anything, and the people have sustained me. Like, when I've gone through challenging times, that's what has, I've been able to pick up the phone and get feedback or get support or, think about something in a different way. And as an emerging leader, I think it's really important to find your people in this space because they will steer you, they will support you in the good and the bad. And I think I'm always growing as a leader. Not to say that I've been doing leading for 10 years, and I know for some that's just a drop in the bucket. We have some leaders that have been doing it for 30, 40 plus years, but I am still learning and I'm still asking questions, and I'm not afraid to say, you know what, I don't know the answer to this. And we'll figure it out. I'll figure it out, right? And having that vulnerability, but also having that strategic lens. Like, you need to still, even if you don't know, like, how are you going to get the answers? How are you going to lead the organization forward is very important. So that constant growth, constant honing of your skills is important. And try and find the joy and the balance in the two. I've only learned this over the last few years about taking time for myself because we know that many leaders are burning themselves out because we pour so much into this work. And you have to create those boundaries where you're still giving yourself self-care or the work will swallow you up, right? And you can't give your best to the work. So it's important to, as you're doing and you're building, you're also making sure that you're taking care of yourself in the process as well.
Thank you. Can I ask you, you made your one of your advices, find your community, find those who will support you through the good and the bad. I wanted to kind of bring it back to the conversation about um, partnership and allyship and how, within the realm or this system of austerity we find ourselves in, is it hard to find your community?
I can only speak personally.
Hmm.
I found my community. It's hard to keep in touch and to maintain, to sustain the community again, because we are so busy that again, speaking as a Black woman who knows so many strong women leaders,
Hmm.
women of color leaders, and who I'd love to be more intentional about like building with, that it's challenging to sustain that piece of it.
Um, Before I sign off, I wanted to circle back to one of your responses that you provided um, about the issue of diversity and leadership. And you were kind of just making a bit of a comment about some of these, say, large not-for-profits or entrenched not-for-profit organizations that have been around a long time, and how perhaps the diversity component hasn't quite reflected today's notions and values around diversity and equity. And you were kind of commenting how can they lead effectively if they're not reflecting the communities they serve. What does this mean for the sector as a whole when you see a lot of these, when you see, I won't say a lot, but let's say when we see these not-for-profit organizations, especially those who have long history and those who are quite large, um, who have yet to be able to fully adopt the current values around equity, diversity, and inclusion. What does that mean for the sector as a whole? And you spoke a little bit about kind of even serving communities who are in need.
Yeah. It's a tough question because I don't want to speak about any specific
No.
organization and I don't know the data and the impact that they
Mhm.
have in terms of like their organization. But what I would say is that from within the sector, thinking about like staffing and human resources, it's like, are people staying? Or are we losing our most talented individuals because they see no opportunities for growth and leadership? And I know a lot of people who have left the sector for many reasons, but one of the reasons are because they don't see opportunities for them. You know, we need to balance being able to have to put a roof over our head and to make a fair wage and have and the hope and goals of moving forward. But if that's not being represented in the organization that you're working in, then many people do leave.
Yeah. Before I conclude this interview, do you have any famous last words, Emma?
Oh, put the pressure on the last words.
Famous last
I,
words.
I, I keep pushing. I need to find who actually said this quote so I can honor and quote them properly. But
Okay.
it goes back to what I said in the beginning. The nonprofit sector, we are tasked with solving the world's problems, and we need to be adequately resourced to be able to do that.
And what will happen if we're not?
We'll continue to exist, but the changes that we could make and the shifts that we could make, um, they either don't happen or they take plentyfold longer to happen, right? I don't even want to say 5 times or twice as much. It will take a long time for us to get to where we need to be.
Great. Well, thank you for your famous last words. So, thank you again, Emma, for sharing your thoughts and views on leadership um, on women's issues as well. It's nice always to have a strong feminist voice in these interviews, and for sharing your views in a very honest and frank way about what you're seeing, what leadership looks like for you and your organization, the challenges you're experiencing, and kind of your own hopes and aspirations as you kind of wind your way around some of these challenges that your organization and many other organizations are facing. And so thank you so much for being part of this interview. It's been truly a pleasure learning more about you and about the work your organization does. And again, thank you, audience, for joining us. And we look forward to having you at the next leadership interview session. Thank you.
Thank you, Simi.